Now, painting realistic watercolour is all about trying to work with fine details, working with very fine lines. So that's what this video is all about. So I'm going to guide you through how I tend to load the brush, for one, and using the lightest of pressure, just the very lightest of pressure, to get those fine details on the paper. But it's all about how much paint you have on your brush and also the consistency of the paint. Okay, so let's get started and I'll show you how I do this. Now when you look at this particular painting, this is one of my video tutorials on my website. So I worked on this by working on individual birds one at a time. So looking at the gold finch, now this was done by using the very short, fine detailed lines, but working in from light paint all the way through to the darker colours. Always start light and go darker as you go along. So that's how I would kind of work on something like this. Don't try and go too dark too quick. When you look at the wolf, I tend to look at the length of the fur. So, for example, around the bridge of the nose, these lines are very short, and you find this with dogs, cats, a lot of animals, in fact. And these lines are also quite directional. So you see the way they curve over. In fact, down the middle of the bridge of the nose, you find that they kind of fan away. But these lines are overlapped gradually using very little paint on the brush and using the finest of marks, so barely touching the paper. The hummingbird itself was done by looking at a wet background wash first, and that's on each individual feather. And then while that's drying, I might add a little bit of detail at the top so it fades into those wet backgrounds. But then when it's really dry, add those lighter, finest marks by, again, barely loading that brush. Working on small critters like, for example, the butterfly here, you gotta, again, think about how much paint you have on your brush. I'm going to go through all these techniques on how I load the brush and give some general idea how this all works. I'll even show you a little bit about watercolour white as well, how that works, because it's quite exciting when you think, okay, we're going to put a load of layers of detail on, for example, these swans first, and then we'll overlay that using watercolour white. But that's something you need to know how to do, and the consistency the white needs to be, and how fine the lines need to be as well. So I'm going to show you how that works very shortly. Okay, paint consistencies. Now, I tend to work on 4 different consistencies, and these are going to be watery, milky, creamy, and thick. Okay, I'll show you what I mean. So if I get my old mixing brush, which is an old acrylic brush, I'm going to add some water. I've got my pipette here, and I'm going to show you the watery version first of all. And we'll do that with the Opera Rose. So that's that one. I've got plenty of water in there. There you go. And I'm going to make that so it literally just runs down the side of the palette, just like the water out of your tap or your faucet. So we're looking at something like that. See, that's not far from there already, so it's just a little bit more water in there. So you're looking at something like that. Look at that, just running straight down the side. There's no slowing it down whatsoever. And that, to me, is watery. Now, the next one I'm going to show you is going to be this one here, which is a cadmium orange. And I want this to be more of a milky consistency. So let's go back in with the water again. So I want this milky. That's a little bit thicker. Then even though it runs down the side of the palette, see what, I'm going to get some more. Bear with me. There we go, that's brighter, isn't it? So if that goes down the side of the palette, you can see how long that takes to go down. A little bit slower than tap water, as you can see. So that to me is milky. Now, the next one, which we tend to use for a lot of fine details, is creamy. So this, we use the cadmium red, I think, for that. So it's a little bit of water this time, a couple of drops, and see if that's enough. Oh, now that is still more of a milky consistency. So I'm going to add a little bit more in. Now I'm using tube paint today, but I do use half pans. Now half pans take that little bit longer to work up. So I'll just show you what I mean, look, just with these here. So when you're trying to work up a colour, like Scarlet Lake, for example, there, you've got to keep working it, and you find that some half pans are stronger than others. So that will also affect the consistency of the paint. So bear that in mind when you're mixing them. So if I go back into this very, very thick, creamy consistency, now there we go, look, that's what I'm after, something like that. So when you run this down the side of the mixing well, you'll find, there you go, see how slow that was? It's going down the fresh one there. That's the kind of speed I'm looking for. A little bit slow, it takes us a good old time going down. And then we've got one left, and that's going to be thick. And that's the phthalo blue. Now thick, if I just get my brush again, this is straight from the tube. I've got a little bit of water in there, but that's straight from the tube. And you'll probably find if you try painting a straight line with a fully loaded brush, and you find sometimes a little bit tricky to handle because it's a bit on the thick side. So I tend to go more for the creamy consistency paint more than the kind of thick consistency. Okay, look how long that takes to go down, see what I mean? It takes a good old time, doesn't it? It really does. So I'll give you some ideas on different consistencies of paint which I tend to work to. So we got watery, milky, creamy and thick. Now I like to make sure I load the brush correctly, because if I overload it, what will happen is when you go to the painting and you try to do some fine lines, you'll find that you end up with like a big blob for one, okay? And you can't quite get them really fine lines. So what I do it this way around, okay? Here we go. So I'm going to load it, and as I pull away, I'll drag up the side, like this, and then I'll roll it and pull away at the same time. Then all I need to do is give it a light dab, just once, maybe even twice, on some kitchen roll, and then you can go to your painting and paint some very fine details. What that basically does, it takes the residual paints off the bristles, giving you a bit more of a kind of finer, sharper tip. And with the kind of very lightest of pressure, you can paint some very fine lines. Okay, so that's a little bit how I tend to load my brush up, just by basically, once again, here we go, load it, roll it as you pull away, get your clean tissue paper, bit of kitchen roll, give it 1 or 2 taps, and then start painting your fine lines. Right, now we know about the consistencies of the paint, and we also know about loading the brush. Let's work on fine lines. So what I'll do actually, I'll just put that there for you. And we'll go for some of the cadmium red. We know that's a creamy consistency, we don't want the thick stuff. So nice and creamy for now. So load it, roll it and pull away, you know all that now anyway. And to get the fine lines, this is after tapping the brush, what we can do is work by barely touching the paper to get really fine wiggly lines. See how fine that is? Now I know this is a size 00 brush, but you can go really fine. So if I take most of the paint off by dabbing it on some kitchen roll first, like that, now the brush is nearly dry, you can go even finer. See that? That's how fine, barely touching the paper. So 2 hairs in air. That's how thin you can get your lines. And this is with say a size 00 brush. Okay, so if I load it again, I'm going to show you how you can go from fine by applying a little bit of pressure. You can go thicker, and then you can come off the pressure again to go fine again, right at the end, pressure again. We're going to run out of paint in a minute, and then fine. Okay, so that's just by pressing on that little bit harder. So the way to look at this really is that when you're starting to paint something very lightly, you just want to catch that paper just a fraction like so. So I'm just catching the paper. So if you're working on fine hairs, say fur or feathers or anything like that, now the brush is nearly dry, look, you can see the texture of the paper coming through. But if you want to work on hairs that are closer to you, or grass, it works the same way. So if you're painting grass, then you can actually increase the thickness of the line by doing that. Okay, let's reload that properly, Paul. See how thick that is now? Just by, adding a little bit more pressure, just like I've shown you on there. So we can go from very thin, very fine like so, to really kind of thick lines and wiggly lines like that, just using the same brush and just varying the amount of the pressure and of course how thick the paint is. So the thicker the paint, I'm going to go into the phthalo blue. Now this is really thick stuff now. really, really thick. I'm going to do the same again. Oh, yeah, it's breaking away. See the difference? So when you compare this one, because it's thicker paint, to the creamy version, that's a difference that you'll get. So you find the line will break. It could break over the texture of the paper. So if I load that again, do exactly the same thing. Load it, roll it and dab it. So I'll do the same again. Try and go fine. There we go. And then put the pressure on. You see it breaking away around the edges? It didn't do that, as you know, with the creamy version. So if I switch back to the creamy again, very fine. Put the pressure on, come off the pressure, and then get nice and fine at the end. So that one didn't break up like the blue. So that's why I tend to use a creamy version to get the thick and thin lines when you're painting all these lovely kind of hairs on a fox or a bird, for feathers, anything like that. Just by overlaying those little fine lines and details. Oh, and I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll pop a card up for you, which will take you to my live video of painting a wren in very fine details, just like I'm doing here, but obviously not in red. So have a look at the link just on the side there. So I'll give you some ideas on what I tend to look at when I'm working my detail brush, and how much paint to add and how much pressure to apply to the paper. And it's all very well using a very detailed brush like this one here, the size 00, where, as you can see, we can get some very fine marks. But what's it like when you use a slightly larger brush? Now, I tend not to paint in very large brushes. It's just something I've never really done. But I'm going to show you a couple of brushes I tend to use. So this is a size 1 and that's a size 5. So if I load my brush with some colour with a size 1, bearing in mind this is obviously quite milky consistency in there at the moment. So load it, roll it, tap it, and here we go. So when you're painting anything with a size 1, you should get something very similar. Make sure you take some paint off first, Paul. So you can go really fine. I can't quite get as fine as a size 00, as you can see here, but I can still get some fairly fine marks using a size 1. But to be honest with you, it depends on the brush. If your brush like this one is quite worn, I've had this one quite a long while now, then you find that the tips tend to round off a little bit. So you find that obviously the very point of that is not quite as pointy as it used to be. They do get worn after a while. My brushes tend to. Okay, so I'm going to try now. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll try with this one first. Let's go for some cadmium orange off screen there. So that's that one there. Look, there you go. So just load that one up. And let's try over this side. Now cadmium orange. Now I'm going really fine. Then I'm going to put some pressure on, and even more pressure, and then come off that pressure again. So you can see how big and fat you can make these lines. Let's try that one more time. Let's try it further up here. Now this one's obviously fairly worn as well. Applying the pressure and coming off that pressure again. Just to get that little tiny mark on the tip. There we go. So I'll give you some ideas on that, and that's just using a size 5. Now see, that's a size 5. Again, I've had that brush for quite some time. Just get that rinsed out a minute. So let's go for a brand new one. So this is a nice size 5. It's got a longer bristle on this as well. I'm going to wash it out first of all. So you tend to get some form of a binder, which tends to bind the bristles together when you first buy a brush. See what I'm going to do? I'm going to get some of my phthalo blue just there. Look, let's add a little bit of water in there. So it's more of a sort of creamy consistency. So I'm going to load it, I'm going to roll it, and then we'll give it a tap again, just off camera there. And we'll try that one. Now this is a brand new brush. Ooh, probably overloaded. But you can see that's too thick, that paint. You can see what I mean when the paint's too thick, how it breaks away. So let's just thin that paint down that little bit more. Just by adding a little bit more water. And the thing is, if you add too much water, then you can just add a little bit more pigment, a bit more colour in there, and press on, a bit more pressure, come off again, breaking away on the surface a little bit. Depends on the texture of the paper as well. If you're using cold pressed paper, which is what I use here, then you have a little bit of texture showing through, which is also quite nice. And you can still get, as you can see, with a kind of large brush, some fairly fine detail especially when you start to run out of paint, okay? That's why when I say to a lot of people, my members, on my website, when they're working on my videos, is that when you start to run out of paint, don't go and load it straight away. Think about those areas where you can just add those finest of marks. And using fine lines again, by using a nearly dry brush, you find you get some very fine details. Remember we did that just around here. Okay, so that'll give you some ideas on how I tend to look at using different sized brushes and to get those fine lines. Now, one of my videos on my website is one of a bumblebee, and it's sat on some very lovely looking purple flowers. And these are the steps I took in order to be able to paint these wings. But I want to be able to kind of paint a line without it breaking. Remember we said about the way it breaks apart, like the blue here, the phthalo blue. So if we have this to a creamy consistency, load it, roll it, tap it. Watch out for any water runs on your metal ferrule here, because if you do, they'll run down your bristles and plop straight onto your paper, which is not very good, I know. I used the same technique by using just a half-loaded brush really, and by working on all individual sections. So the idea was, I'd paint out the outline of the sort of veins in the middle of a wing first. So let's just get a little bit more colour. Okay, so you're going to be two sides to that outline, something like that. That's what we need to do. Very, very brief. And then all the sections in between that, all I did was little tiny, I don't know, boxes, nothing too even, like so. And that's using hardly any paint on the brush, as you can see. And also the lightest of touches as well. Oh, don't forget to click on that like button down below this video, just a way of supporting my work, so thank you in advance. And you can use this for all sorts of transparent wings like butterflies, obviously bumblebees, which is a good one as well. Give us some general idea on how to use a fine brush for something like that. Now, when I'm painting, I'm trying to think about angles all the time. And trying to get the angles right, I've got a bit of paint on the brush here. Trying to get the angles right is always tricky, really is. So how do I do that? I use what I call, it's just something I call it, I don't know why, ghosting. So all it simply is, if I just try and demonstrate this here for you, if I want to try and get a curve, I'm going to use a kind of natural movement of my wrist or my hand to get a curve. And if you want to get the curve the opposite way, you can turn your paper around to get that natural kind of bend of your wrist, and also the way your fingers tend to work. So before I touch the paper, I want to say, for example, whiskers on a cat. Okay, so something like that. What I'll do, I'll very lightly kind of go over the area before touching the paper like so. So get the idea where I want to go, and then what I'll do, I'll allow the brush to just gently graze the surface to create that little fine line for a whisker. See the idea? So that's the way I tend to work it. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll pop a little card up for you for a video which I've done for my members on my website on how to paint a leopard, and I'll show you how I did the whiskers on that as well, so you can have a look at that. So see how fine you can get. So you're going to ghost it first, okay? So you know where you want to go. I want to put one in that angle there. So I'll just ghost it, and then I will very lightly, I've already got the feel of the distance and the kind of curve that I want to get. Just draw a line, and if you want to go longer, overlap them a little bit like so, and then you've already got some very fine hairs, or whiskers, should I say, in this case, on for something like a cat, a dog, a mouse, any little creature that's got whiskers basically. So it's a little bit about how I paint very fine lines for whiskers, and by ghosting first. Now, just to show you this in practice, here's a clip from my main leopard painting on my website, and when I first started painting the whiskers. Now my painting is on its side because it makes that a little bit easier to do that ghosting effect. So you see what I mean when you watch me do the first whiskers. Gradually working out where it goes. So we've got one here, working my way through. See, that paint was too dry, probably even a little bit too thick. Something like that. Okay, there you go, there's one already. Or you can start from the other end and then finish at the same point. So I can extend that now if I want to. Just bring that down for you. So I can go over the same line Very carefully though, and extend that line even further along if I want to. Try and keep it nice and smooth. So just to recap, when you look at the swans and all the layers of detail added into the swans, you can see how they all work now by overlapping these fine lines. And the same goes for all the wood effects as well. So again, we're using fine details by varying the thickness, the creaminess or the milkiness, depends how you look at it, of the colour. And also going back to the hummingbird, now working on the wings, again that's all fine details, but the same applies to the very, very fine marks around the eye. And mentioning eyes, the wolf itself, we've got to think about those eyebrows around the top and the way they tend to overlap one another as well. So it's all done by using the same technique. And then finally, on the paintings, we're looking at the 5-bird painting again, where as you can see, even down to the texture of the wood, it's all done in fine details. So when you look at one of my more recent video tutorials on my website, this one is of a very beautiful butterfly called a golden heliconian butterfly or golden helicon. And this particular one is done through a lot of fine detail again. So even working on these legs, you can see by making sure that your brush is not overloaded with too much paint really pays off, because you can add those finest of marks. So for example, working on these 2 legs here, well, there's actually more than 2, there's 6, but working on the legs there, you can see I'm adding the finest of hairs, just pulling them out from the damp paint, which is still a little bit damp on the leg, to create those. Then working on the antennae as well, and usual thing applies by having very little paint on the brush itself. You can really think about really adding those finest of marks initially, and by mapping out the area to begin with, by doing so and doing it really thin, then after that you can start to widen it and thicken it down a little bit more thereafter. So always think about working fine and thinner before you start going thicker, if you know what I mean. So working on that idea. So I'm adding this using a little bit of bluey black colour at the moment. Trying to think about the colours while I'm using the fine details. And also the consistency of the paint is now to a creamy consistency. But I started off, if you remember, with a very light colour to begin with. Now one of the things that people find tricky is the use of watercolour white. Now it depends how you load it. It depends on the quality of the white as well, and the type of white paint. Just make sure it's an opaque white to begin with. And you want this more to a creamy consistency. So let's get that creamy. Also, it's a tubed version, not a half pan version. Keep going, keep going. Try and get it creamy like that. There you go. And then we'll just load that up. Now, when you're using watercolour white, the same principle applies, is that you just need to add very, very little pressure. And the more pressure you apply, obviously the wider and the thicker the line will be. So to show you on this here, so if I just put a little light line like that, and I'm going to increase the pressure and then come off that line, then you find you get some very fine marks like so. So it all depends on how you load the brush to begin with. So remember, get that nice fine tip like I've shown you to begin with. Quick one little tap there. And then you can add things like, imagine this being a background of, say, a white dog, okay? Then you can start to add the fine fur lines going over the top. Overlaying. The brush is just about run out of paint again, runs out very quickly. But you can see how fine those marks can now go because of just about run out of paint until you can't get anything off it. But working in layers like this, using your detail brush for fine lines and using watercolour white paint or white gouache, doesn't really matter, as long as it's opaque in colour, then you find you can really achieve some very fine lines. So if I overload this brush, get a bit of water there, okay, I'm not going to roll it or anything like that, I'm going to overload it on purpose. And I'll try to touch the paper to create a fine line if I can. Nope, not going to do it, because I've just overloaded that brush to begin with. Yes, it's nice and bright white, brilliant, but it's just too overloaded. You can't really control that. But what you can, if you want it just as white on the other ones, you can go over the same line again, if you want to, like so. Okay, thin it out at the top there, Paul. There we go. You can even drag out some of the paint, oh it's dried already, from other lines if it's still wet. Or you can go over the top of that as well, just to thin it out. And that could be a close-up hair or something like that. So when you're working on, say for example, at the top of an eye, let's just draw a rough eye, just the outline of a top of an eye. You can now imagine if it's a white animal, using these fine lines to kind of branch up the eyebrows, if you wish, above the eye, can make a huge difference. Okay. Now don't use too much white paint, you can always add more later. Now if you have difficulty painting fine lines in watercolour, put a comment in the description down below and let me know. But there you go, it's a little bit about watercolour white and the fine lines that you can achieve. So that gives some ideas how I tend to get those very, very fine details with my little tiny brush. But let me just show you how easy it can actually be. So have a look at the video to my right and you'll see what I mean. So that's a playlist on using watercolour white. I'll see you there.